everyone. So today I'll be discussing my MA dissertation research, an ongoing project which is titled The Classicisation of the Norse Past, Snorri Sturluson and the Icelandic Matter. I'll begin by providing some context on intellectual culture in 13th century Iceland, before outlining the areas of scholarship which have inspired my approach to the concepts of cultural memory and spatial history. After giving a brief summary of my research method and source base, I will present a comparative case study of Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda and the Icelandic hemispherical world map, in order to offer some conclusions that I've already discerned from my research. Most importantly, I will argue for the need to study medieval Icelandic intellectual culture in its broader European context. This paper is a condensation of the research I've completed and will be writing up over the next few months, so I'm very welcoming of any feedback that might benefit my final piece of work. So, there are three things I'd like to explain about my title before I begin. The first is that I use the term Norse past as the best way to frame the equal interrelatedness of the three main themes of my study: memory, myth, and history. Secondly, classicisation signifies the cultural movement in which stories from antiquity, like the fall of Troy, provided late medieval writers with a starting point for their own country's classical origin narratives. My focus here is on Iceland, because just like various other European peoples, medieval Scandinavians recognized the benefit of fixing their past in the recognizable paradigm of ancient history. The Icelandic matter therefore draws parallels with the more academically familiar matters of Britain, France, and Rome, and serves here to draw Iceland into its broader European context. Finally, in Norse scholarship, Snorri Sturluson is widely recognised as one of Iceland's prime historical actors. His historiographical and mythographic texts provide the core evidence for my dissertation's analysis of intellectual culture in 13th century Iceland. Snorri offers the strongest example of an Icelandic scholar tracing Norse origins back to the Trojans. I've evaluated his works alongside native and continental sources in order to most effectively engage with the potential worldviews of learned Icelanders in the 13th century. So, some historical context. By the 13th century, the spreading of universal histories and geographical knowledge meant Icelanders were increasingly aware of their country's peripheral location on the edge of Europe. At the same time, a strained political relationship with Norway meant Icelandic elites saw it as their duty to preserve their unique pre-Christian heritage and a variety of cultural forms. As part of this, the writing of origin histories allowed Icelandic intellectuals to reinforce a sense of their people's belonging in universal history, while continuing to value the specifics of Norse culture. In the later medieval period especially, history writing played an important role in the identity formation of newly established institutions and nations, by controlling how particular events, individuals, and groups were remembered by future generations. Several scholars have discussed how classical myths influenced the writing of Frankish, Norman, British, and Danish national origin myths. Within this, Virgil's Aeneid is the most prominent example of how medieval audiences consumed the classical interest in national destiny as a secular parallel to biblical history. However, there's lacking scholarship on how this intellectual tradition took shape in medieval Iceland. I'm interested in what Snorri's systematization of the Icelandic matter can tell us about the competing peripheral and universal worldviews of 13th century Icelanders, and how this relates to notions of history, memory, and identity. This will provide valuable insight into the interrelationship between historical and geographical knowledge and medieval intellectual culture, and demonstrate the value of studying history and myth as foundational aspects of cultural memory. Jan Assmann's well-known studies of cultural memory discuss the centrality of formative myths and histories to what he called identity-confirming knowledge. The term cultural memory encompasses the institutional and social functions of historical consciousness. This is inherently related to the formation of individual self-identities within a particular society's shared social and temporal arena of experience. Here, the concept is useful for thinking about how historical and geographical knowledge influence medieval people's perceptions of their own temporal and spatial place in history. Elsa Mundau suggested Icelanders' interest in origins was especially prevalent. For a society whose settlement was not in the unreachable past, origin narratives were intimately related to the strengthening of familial and communal identities during the social turbulence of the Sturlung Age. Texts produced in 13th century Iceland were cultural responses to political, social, and religious change. Therefore, they provide a particularly interesting source base for rethinking the distinctions between history and reality, myth and memory in medieval historiography. Intermingling memory studies with spatial studies is crucial for accomplishing the task set by John Lindau at the end of his essay, which studied Icelandingabok as a foundation myth. To better understand how Icelanders made sense of themselves, of their identity and their society within the wider geographic and historical world in which they lived. My own conceptual approach to space is inspired by an array of cross-disciplinary methodologies. For the purposes of today's paper, the most important point to note is that I'm interested in how Iceland's cultural, ideological, and theological identities influence representations of Icelandic and global space in historical texts and maps. By focusing on the Icelandic appropriation of the Trojan origin myth, my dissertation will demonstrate how intellectual processes of myth-making and history writing were inextricably linked with spatial manifestations of Norse memories in texts, images, and landscapes. So, whereas scholars have previously examined Snorri's Edda as a compilation of pre-Christian mythology, I will be studying it as a representation of the overlap between ecclesiastical and secular learning in late medieval intellectual culture. As the clearest and most systematic example of the Trojan origin myth being appropriated into Norse culture, the Edda will be the primary source of my study. However, I've also undertaken an in-depth reading of Snorri's Heimskringla for further insight into his historiographical agenda as a non-clerical scholar with ties to the Norwegian court. I will also be comparing Snorri's origin myth with other written Icelandic histories, such as the 12th century Icelandingabok. This will allow me to more fully determine the balance between native versus classical influences on the historical and mythical shaping of Norse cultural memory. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae is an ideal European parallel to Snorri's Icelandic matter, due to its similar historiographical manipulation of the Trojan origin myth in the written vernacular. Such comparisons are crucial for situating Icelandic texts in their broader continental contexts. This is in turn essential for re-evaluating the reality of Icelandic exceptionalism, a nationalist ideal that has been promoted by scholars of Norse culture in the past. My decision to read textual and cartographic sources together was inspired by scholars who've investigated the historiographical as well as geographical concerns of medieval mapmakers. David Woodward and Evelyn Edson's studies in particular encouraged me to think about what medieval encyclopedic documents can tell us about perceptions of space and time in the medieval mind. Most influentially, Dale Kedwoods' PhD thesis on cartography and culture in medieval Iceland emphasized the importance of examining medieval maps in their manuscript contexts. By uncovering the underlying intentions and perceptions of mapmakers and their readers, Kedwoods offers a new perspective of the scientific and religious, as well as cultural and political, underpinnings of Icelandic cartography. My project will complement Kedwoods' approach to medieval space, but it will go further by comparing Icelandic maps with historical narratives produced at the same time. My interdisciplinary method, in evaluating the context and content of textual and visual sources comparatively, will provide deeper insight into the relationship between medieval history writing and cartographic creation. This will further uncover the relationship between historical consciousness and geographical awareness in the learned medieval mind. Careful consideration of authorial intentions and manuscript contexts will reduce the risk of total speculation about the correlation between the transmission of historical and geographical knowledge and ideological conceptions of mythical memory and historical space. Ultimately, uncovering the parallels between literary and visual depictions of Icelandic and global space exposes a flexible intimacy between Norse culture, classical traditions, and historical and geographical realities. Due to the intellectual nature of these sources, the following conclusions are centered on what we can draw from surviving manuscript evidence about learned Icelanders' perceptions of their country's place in world history. This focus will shed light on how a peripheral geographical location can influence inward self-perceptions and outer worldviews, opening a broader discussion about the center versus periphery dichotomy in intellectual history. The medieval mentalities I'm proposing to examine are unavoidably elite ones. I'm concerned with how notions of memory and space influence the identities and worldviews of a particular learned group. Still, my conceptual framework and interdisciplinary approach offers fresh insight into the secular and ecclesiastical overlaps underpinning the creative minds behind medieval intellectual culture. So I'll now present a comparative case study of a written origin myth and a visual world map to demonstrate how we can bring text and image together to provide a fuller picture of the complex worldviews of medieval people. First, we have Snorri's Prose Edda, an early 13th century compilation of all Norse poetic traditions and mythological stories. This vernacular text was composed 2 centuries after Iceland's official conversion to Christianity, at which time Snorri would have been receptive to the intellectual traditions of Western Europe. In the Edda's prologue, Snorri explains to his Christian audience that the Aesir, the Norse gods, were descended from Trojan migrants who escaped the fall of Troy. They then became worshipped by the first Scandinavian settlers after founding prosperous dynasties across Northern Europe. Scholars have previously explained this origin narrative as a theological attempt to incorporate Norse pagan traditions into a Christian framework. However, in considering why Snorri chose to combine Norse culture with classical traditions, it's important to remember the overlaps between ecclesiastical and secular learning in late medieval intellectual culture. Immediately before this passage on Troy, Snorri provides an outline of world geography, taking his audience through the 3 continents, Africa, Europe, and Asia, where he locates the middle of the world close to Troy. As a mixture of world history, geography, and myth, Snorri's prologue makes a deliberate spatial and temporal link between Scandinavian history and the Earth's geographical center. By demonstrating his familiarity with contemporary Latin learning about the structure of the Earth's zones, Snorri anchored his mythical narrative in geographical reality. The prologue certainly played a part in Snorri's efforts to rationalize his ancestors' pagan beliefs, and yet, by investigating how his awareness of Iceland's peripheral location influenced his worldly perceptions, we can study this classical origin narrative as a product of 13th century Icelanders' desire to form a Scandinavian branch of universal history. So another example of a simultaneously historiographical and geographical source, this one visual, is the late 13th century hemispherical world map. This Icelandic map is one of 5, which survive in several encyclopedic compilations. It illustrates the world's 3 continents, much like typical mappamundi produced at the same time. Yet, the hemispherical world map is unique in that it contains 21 inscriptions in a mixture of Latin and Old Norse. In its manuscript context, the map is surrounded by more astronomical and geographical notes in the vernacular, and a treaty situating Iceland at the northernmost point of the globe, directly above Jerusalem. What we can take from this is that the encyclopedia's compiler was aware of Iceland's peripheral location, and recognized the value of incorporating Old Norse terms into Latin learning. By making a connection with the well-known spiritual center of Christendom, like Snorri, they integrated their unique perspective of worldly space into the global visualizations of their European counterparts. This map is perhaps more theologically focused than Snorri's text. I certainly have more work to do to further uncover the intermingling of classical and biblical myths in my selected sources. But already, this comparable evidence illustrates how Icelandic intellectual spatial perceptions became an amalgamation of the historical and mythological as they sought to fit their peripheral worldly perspectives into a universal historical narrative. Ultimately, considered alongside native cartographic sources, the Edda's prologue provides sufficient evidence for the overlapping of classical, biblical, and Norse memories in learned medieval Icelanders' spatial and temporal outlooks on the known world. In this paper, I hope I've demonstrated that tackling the conceptual challenges of cultural memory and spatial theory is crucial to understanding the interrelationships between history and myth, temporality and space in medieval historiography. International perspectives of medieval intellectualism have ignored local variations, but I want to prove what a seemingly isolated culture can reveal about the complexity of medieval thought and self-perceptions. I also hope this insight into 13th century Iceland's intellectual culture has opened your mind to the place of Norse cultural memory in its broader European context. Icelandic history writing and cartographic creation did not exist independently from medieval European intellectualism, but rather flourished within it. This is an ideal demonstration of why we must not put strict geographical boundaries on the history of ideas. Thank you.